Now it was end of the 70s. And actually this is not a monograph, but rather a report on knowledge, written after the demand of the Quebec Municipal Authority. However, it's a strange report, not like the reports that we are used to read nowadays. Okay, it's a report on knowledge. It does not give us figures, numbers, how many schools there are, what they are doing, how many students do they have, etc., etc. But rather, if you like, attempts a qualitative interpretation of the situation. Okay. And the interesting point was that actually everybody was, what the report does here is simply to state in rather clear and almost undeniable terms what everybody began to feel from the turn of the century actually. Some in science have already been visible from the turn of the century, but of course the experiences of some perhaps in those times nobody expected, would be widespread, common, and turn out to be the basic determinant of our contemporary experiences. Okay, so you should not think that this was the first one, neither gonna be the last one, I think. But what the report does in its main lines, in its main outline, is this. To indicate, to point a finger actually on a certain significant, important change in the constitution of knowledge and our relationship with it. Okay. And at the very beginning page, actually, Lyotard makes it clear that what marks our period different from the earlier ones in terms of the constitution of knowledge. I'm not saying our conception of knowledge, how the way we understand knowledge, etc. The very constitution of knowledge and our relationship with it, I am saying, okay, undergoes a very tremendous change, and this change is marked by, so to speak, the loss of our capacity to believe in meta-narratives, he says, okay. In the opening sentence here, in the extract they are assigned to you, the argument starts by saying that actually in modern times, or he defines modern knowledge and its major representative modern science as a discourse of knowledge referring to meta-narratives. Okay. By meta-narratives, he goes on to explain, he means that those specific narratives which cannot be found directly in scientific discourse, but somehow aligned to the scientific discourse to establish the legitimacy of it. Okay. The interesting point is that, one interesting observation actually he makes is this, okay. Science or scientific discourse, according to him, is not enough to establish its own legitimacy. Okay. What do we understand by this term? Why do you think he concluded that science cannot establish its own legitimacy? What do we mean by when we say talk about the legitimacy of science or talk about the need of establishing the legitimacy of science? What do you understand by it? Try to get a little bit active. What's the legitimacy of science? Why someone come along and think that science needs a certain legitimacy? Isn't it enough that science produces statements of truth? That we say, for instance, as sociologists, that so many this or that, giving way to the rise of or decrease of so many degrees or rise of this or that again.
Science'dan başka truth claim'leri olan alanlar da varsa eğer, hani Science'ın kendisini legitime etmesinin çok da geçerli olmadığını insan söylüyor olabilir. Yani kendi içinde tutarlıdır evet ama diğerleri de tutarlı. O zaman ne yapacağız mı demek istiyorum.
More, a little bit more than that. Yeah, scientific statements do already aim at some consistency. Yani any contradictory finding or statements are tried to be either eliminated or to be solved, to be resolved as to re-establish consistency in science, scientific discourse. No problem with it. Well, for a minute, think yourselves as scientists and try to come up with an explanation why you are doing this, rather than engaging in any other occupation. What legitimizes the scientist? Its higher status and sometimes perhaps, or at least relatively higher income to some other segments of the society. What is it? And you know, today enormous sums of funds have been investigated in so-called scientific research. Why? What's the reason for this? Why you want to be at the head of an important scientific project, for instance? If you wish to be, of course. Why are you going to do that? Now, first of all, one can say out of curiosity, okay, I'm curious, I'm willing to know, I like to know what's going on, what's happening, okay, in this or that matter. Okay, so one factor we can say, curiosity. But do you think curiosity enough to anyone to devote oneself onto some certain project, okay, or to spend enormous sums of money? Think about that CERN project over there, okay? Up until now, as far as I know, it has been swallowed up the highest amount of money so far which had been invested in any scientific project. Why? And you know, CERN apparently, or as they claim, okay, does not aim at any practical utilitarian results. Okay. The governments pay money, lots of scientists going over there conducting their own research as part of the larger research. And the main problem, the major reason for such a big institution to be established is nothing else than that simple question, okay? As far as I have watched the documentary, if the documentary was correct, okay, prepared by the physicists themselves, the main reason to be able to resolve some theoretical problems, whether there was a Higgs boson, God's particle, okay, and what its value was, having no practical implications whatsoever. Okay, so what will happen if we know that there was such a boson, for instance? What will happen if we know that its value is somewhere, say, as far as I remember, 115 nano, I don't remember the exact what it was, measure or unit here, okay, whatever it was, 115 and 114, okay. Now, some were expecting that its value should appear, show itself closer to 115, some others claiming that it should be closer to 140. What the difference, yeah? Why they were trying to do this? Why are you gonna, if you are going to be, of course, why, when you get to be sociologists, why are you gonna engage yourself in research projects? Is it because simply they pay you for this engagement, or is there something else? We are just sitting here, okay, as students. We didn't much think about what a scientific practice is when we are first enrolling to the university, and perhaps the overwhelming majority of you would have no concern with it after the graduation at all, okay? Simply forget it and delve into the difficulties or whatever it is, events of life, okay? Fine, that's good, all right. But some of you will prefer to stay here and will replace me one day, or the other instructors trying to write down papers, explain the world some such interesting fact, so on and so forth, okay? Why? Can we say that simply because it's one of the occupations that may pay good enough for me, so that the payment is there, so I'm finding an employment, trying to find an employment for myself, and here comes the position at the university, and I grab it. What do you say? You say nothing? Okay, well, it appears at least to Lyotard that such an explanation is not enough to legitimize scientific practice. Is it? Lyotard says so, let's believe him, okay? So he also adds that despite all the other efforts, okay, scientific practice or scientific discourse cannot produce out of its own discourse the grounds for its legitimation. Therefore, it had to apply to some certain meta-narratives for that function of legitimation to be fulfilled, okay? For instance, one alternative could be referring to that justice, the idea of justice, that people deserve to live a better life, okay? That therefore, for the improvement of their life, we have to do what we can, okay? So science helps us to improve people's lives, okay? As well as, of course, another very important aspect of justice being that people should learn, okay? People need to be saved from the darkness of ignorance, okay? So that we have to develop our knowledge of the world on the one hand, and on the other hand, try to teach people, okay, the truths of the world, okay? This is the major meaning of actually the original meaning, at least, of the scientific publications, okay? One of the major conditions of scientific practice is to publicize the results, okay? For what? For that the others can as well learn, okay? So you share what you have found, okay, so that the others can save themselves from that piece of ignorance, however tiny, little it can be, okay? Another aspect, of course, of this, this basis, according to Lyotard itself, on the ideals of the French Revolution, that we all constitute that big family, members of that big family called humanity, that we all are equal, okay, that we all equally deserve to be treated decently in accord with our human dignity, so on and so forth, okay? And to be able to do this, one needs to develop the idea of citizen, okay? The idea of citizen. You gotta be citizens here, okay? So science, while producing new knowledge through the quite widespread school system, spreads this knowledge. In other words, transmits this knowledge to the larger sections of the society. So illuminating them, saving them from the darkness of their ignorance, and making them responsible citizens, okay? So in a way, contributing in an important way to their emancipation, to their rising up upon their own fate as independent citizens, autonomous independent citizens. Okay. One form of legitimation, Baudrillard was saying, was therefore rather can be considered somehow political, legal, practical. Okay. And such a discourse, as you can see, cannot produce in scientific discourse. Scientific statements does not have any relevance to the question of justice. Okay, so therefore, it has been produced outside of this scientific discourse in the political world, in the legal world, and by connecting itself, science finds out a way to legitimize itself. This is one of the alternatives, according to Lyotard. Another alternative, and this first alternative, political legal alternative, he says, primarily give importance to school system rather than the institutions of higher education. Okay. So what's important, more important in such a form of legitimation is to acquire a widespread system of education. Okay. Capable of touching each and every citizen. As you may know, universities cannot perform such a function. Okay. Only a few elect can attend to the universities and so on. Simply because being at the university requires higher investments in the education. Okay. And each and every step you take in the educational ladder, it comes with an expense, okay? It requires a serious investment on part of your families, okay? So the second one, however, another important meta-narrative actually, and actually which shaped the logic of the higher institutions of education in modern times, okay? The German model. We have discussed Hegel. I haven't touched upon much on the ideas of Fichte, Schleiermacher, and some others as well. But one can say that with some certain modifications, of course, the other model bases itself onto the idea of the spirit developed by Hegel. Okay. And finds its expression and incarnation in the foundation of the University of Berlin at about the beginning of the 19th century. Okay. The interesting point was that actually Wilhelm Humboldt, somebody called Wilhelm Humboldt, which was a linguist and quite influenced by the ideas, Hegelian ideas, Fichtean ideas, much more than them perhaps, by Schleiermacher's views. Schleiermacher was a very important figure in the formation of modern Protestantism, as well as the development of modern hermeneutics, as it has been later discussed. Okay, so it appears that the model proposed by Schleiermacher turns out to be a much more liberal model. We will see what that kind of model was that briefly. Okay, much more liberal model, and Humboldt preferred this. And strangely enough, this liberal model, this liberal preference, had been done in a political unity, which in those days called as Prussia, okay, which has been pointed out as one of the most strictly formed kind of modern states. Okay. You know, it had a very long and well-established tradition of militarism. It had a very strong political government. Okay, and within that body, we see the development of the modern university. And strangely enough, more than that, if it was one single case, it could not be important. But the strange thing was that that model had been tried to be reproduced in every part of the world. Okay, each and every newly founded modern university, an institution which is worth to be called modern university, modeled itself after that example. Okay. So, including our university here, okay, carries something from the Humboldtian University of Berlin, okay. Okay, what was this second meta-narrative? That second meta-narrative interwoven its arguments, as I said, okay, in the Hegelian idea of the life of the spirit. If the first one, the French model, Lyotard calls it the French model, if the first one was developed along the political-legal lines of a discourse of justice and emancipation, this one developed around, so to speak, philosophy. Not any ordinary philosophy, but a speculative philosophy. Okay. That was the reason why, for instance, institutions that would be named as universities are required to include an arts and science faculty, okay? You know, here, this is a technical university, and actually, practically speaking, in the contemporary organization of knowledge, one may not need the existence of such departments like sociology, philosophy, history, or whatever else in our building, okay? Simply because they do not fit into the larger body of that university. This is a university specialized in the teaching or development of technology. Middle East Technical University, you know. Other universities may be specialized on other things, such as medicine, you know. An example can be given, Hacettepe University, for instance. The main bulk of the academic staff being experts on medical sciences, okay? So on and so forth, okay? So one can ask oneself, why in such a technical university you have to come across with a department called philosophy? Okay. Why? Aren't there any other university to which to locate a department of philosophy would be much more appropriate? For instance, Ankara University, okay, with its famous faculty, Siyasal Bilgiler Fakültesi, Faculty of Political Sciences, the most strong faculty in terms of social sciences in Turkey. Okay, why it's not enough to confine social sciences in such a university specialized in study of the social, okay, rather than spreading it onto all other universities, you know? I do not know. The law has changed in the recent last decade, as far as I know. But prior to that, it would not be possible to call an institution with the name university without the existence of that faculty, arts and sciences. Okay. Why do you think is it? Yeah, out of a certain caprice, no, I like arts and sciences, okay, so each and every university that would be founded, okay, should necessarily include such a faculty. Do you think that was the aim of the decision maker? Yeah, I guess not, simply because it had a very good reason and very good explanation in its relationship with particular sciences and all those departments of engineering, etc., etc. Okay. Simply because this constitutes the speculative part. According to this, as we have seen earlier, okay, starting with Kantian arguments as well, okay, you know, first of all, at the first sight, one can say that, before entering into this discussion, let me point this out, one can say that, at the first glance, one can come to conclude that in such a model, basing itself on the notion of the life of the spirit, okay, knowledge or science can be understood or had been understood in terms of for its own sake. You know, we have heard such slogans earlier, okay? Art for art, science for science, okay? So therefore, scientific practice does not concern itself with any other concern, meaning that it does not care much about the questions of justice, as it has been told in the political-legal narrative, okay? And on the other hand, as persons, as people, somehow to this or that degree, sharing the general concerns of humanity. When we put ourselves in the place of a scientist, for instance, working for the development of A-bomb, okay, that famous A-bomb, one may feel oneself responsible, you know, responsible for taking a role in the creation, in the production of such a dangerous weapon. What do you think? Okay, if you do not concern yourself with any other concern but only science, you wouldn't care much about it. But you know, as human beings, as somehow this or that degree partake in the concerns of humanity, we ourselves may feel ourselves responsible in partaking in this. This responsibility shows our concern for justice, our concern for human emancipation and so on. You know? We do not like, as scientists, even though we know that the sciences, the knowledge, the technology is based upon this knowledge, okay, may yield such results, we prefer as scientists that these results should not be used in the production of such dangerous things, but rather for the production of the things which can be utilizable, good for people. Okay? For instance, we are trying to work on a microchip to be able to produce it cheaper. Why? Because the larger segments of population can use it at the same time. Okay, well, on the other hand, of course, one can say that the company which invests money on such a project does not concern much about this, may not share this humanistic concern of the scientist, but rather be motivated by profit maximization, for instance, to get a larger share of the market and so on. On the other hand, we as scientists, okay, accepting this as well, and perhaps hoping that by bringing these two motivations, we can affect the doing of some good. Okay. However, in the second one, there, as you can see, it gives the appearance that science for its own sake, therefore does not care about the humanity, okay, or the questions of justice or emancipation. This may be misleading, even though it is not wrong on the one hand, however, okay, simply because this speculative question with regard to the life of the spirit formulates the matter in a quite different way, okay. And this is as such, okay, this is why there are, or there were, in each and every university, gotta be a faculty of arts and sciences, okay. This considers, a la Kantian fashion, okay, truth in a rather different fashion, and does not find the value of truth or attribute the value of truth any particular statement, scientific statement in its own self. Okay. From this perspective, the truth value of the statement does not come from the statement's correspondence to the facts, okay, but rather it does originate from the possibility of locating that statement in the larger body of knowledge, locating that statement in a rather meaningful manner in the larger body of knowledge. In other words, what it emphasizes is rather the coherence of the body of knowledge. Okay? If you are not able to locate a given statement in this existing body of knowledge, this means that it does not represent truth. Okay. So this is why this coherence refers to the coherence of the life of the spirit. Okay? And in scientific practice at the universities, through the mediacy of the activities of the scientists, actually what is revealing itself in the form of knowledge is nothing else than this life of the spirit. Okay? Spirit, by making use of the individual scientists and the institutions, etc., reveals itself in the form of knowledge unto itself. Okay? Remember, this was the Hegelian ideal when he explained us that it came to, it aims, or at least, to the formation of absolute knowledge. And by saying absolute knowledge, he was referring to this discrepancy between spirits being in itself and for itself. Okay? It was the separation of the spirit as the spirit in itself and as the spirit for itself, representing nothing else than that alienation, that split in the spirit, right? Spirit, therefore, through this development, undergoes certain stages of this internal split, okay, in itself, for itself. Now, in itself practically means that nature over there, okay, and for itself practically means that part of the spirit returning back and looking onto itself and coming to know something about itself. Okay? So in this way, the spirit turns out to be for itself. And the whole development actually is in the direction of the resolution of that conflict between these two states of the spirit. And when spirit arrives at the sameness at a certain stage where it can establish the sameness of its own being in itself and for itself, then Hegel starts to talk about absolute knowledge. So the universities, therefore, the higher institution of education, turns out to be the more important element here, in contradistinction to the other. Okay, and the collective efforts of the sciences, okay, trying to explain spirits, okay, through the immediacy of the spirit, okay, to itself. To whom? To the spirit itself. And by whom the spirit had been represented in that state? By that higher state of awareness which has been arrived by humanity at that moment. Okay? In that particular nation, in that particular state, and in that particular people, the scientists. Okay? Therefore, within this model, it was possible to develop the idea of the autonomy of the sciences as well as the corresponding institutions, universities, okay, from any other intervention apart from the concerns of telling the truth. Okay. So truth comes first, and scientists being not responsible before any authority other than the truth. A Fichte, for instance, would almost come to stamp his foot and say that truth and only the truth constitutes the ground of our responsibility, okay, and nothing else. So, however, since this has been established by one of the most strong and militaristically strong states of the period, the Prussian state, okay, it was difficult to establish such absolute autonomy of the institutions. But Wilhelm von Humboldt somehow succeeded to ensure, to secure a certain degree of autonomy of the university, at least from political intervention, even though he had to make concessions to the question of justice. Okay, therefore, this university assumes a double function. Okay, one of the functions is to develop the existing body of knowledge as to allow the spirit to come to its own knowledge, on the one hand, okay, and on the other hand, to help the nation to rear up, to grow, to educate, to cultivate its necessary cadres, okay. the pioneering cadres, which would be important functionaries in the organization of the nation. Quite a nationalistic model, as you can see. And that model, modern university, roughly, not roughly, exactly corresponding to the ideal of the modern nation state. Okay? The nation requires powerful, well-educated cadres, okay, for its greatness, and university is there to educate them. Okay. So there are two functions. First, developing or producing new knowledge through all these research, investigations, projects, etc., etc. On the other, to transmit that knowledge to a larger body of the citizens. Larger body, relatively larger body, okay? Relatively larger body, larger than the body of the scientists. It does not aim such a widespread enlightenment, as you can see, simply because the number of students a university can educate is quite limited with respect to the number of the students which can be educated through widespread schooling system. Okay? But of course, the degree of education or the form of knowledge which is transmitted are quite different in these two institutions. Okay? One is for the ordinary citizen, the other for the cadres, future cadres of the nation, which are elected through special procedures. Okay. Fine. Now, the interesting point was that, in Lyotard's argument, these were the basic arguments shaping our concern with science, our concern with knowledge throughout the modernity. But at the end of the 70s, it appears to Lyotard that we no longer are capable of believing in such narratives, such stories, fairy tales. At the end of the 1970s, such things, even I can say that being seen, far from simply being seen as fairy tales to our eyes, turn out to be almost undesirable. And he says that after this loss of credibility into the meta-narratives, what comes to the foreground, but this time stripped of its political-legal content, justice and emancipation, okay, that schooling system back again, the French model back again, okay, and began to dominate our contemporary situation. And this emptying off or stripping off this school model from its political-legal content, justice concerns with justice and emancipation, locates us in a different relationship with knowledge, and at the same time enforcing a very serious transformation at that institution of higher education called universities. Okay? While at this one hand, universities losing their privilege or their power to be the centers of knowledge production on the one hand, okay, therefore turning into schools of higher education, but in a different sense, no longer aiming at the production of new knowledge and integration of this knowledge into a larger body. That speculative element I have forgot in this connection to emphasize. This indeed explains why there was it was a necessity for each university to have a faculty of arts and sciences. Okay. It implies that the empirically produced knowledge, it does not reject the requirement of empiric production of knowledge. Okay. But it claims that the empirically produced knowledge as such does not constitute knowledge. Okay. So as I said earlier, for it to be able to be accepted as a knowledge, it needs to be located in a larger body of the and this turned out to be primarily the task of philosophy, okay? Uniting all the existing body of knowledge into one single coherent whole, okay? So you can, if you like, may add to this philosophy, by the side of philosophy, what the Germans used to call Geisteswissenschaften, translated into English not as social sciences, but sciences of the spirit, okay? Among which you can find sociology, psychology, and other sciences as well, related with the spirit, life of the spirit, okay? That was why a university must necessarily had to have the faculty of arts and sciences, okay, to ensure the unity and coherence of the existing body of knowledge. Okay, fine. Now another interesting point is that in this new development, first of all, we have lost our capacity to believe in, and we brought back, we give up that model of university, and actually we are, according to Lyotard, somehow, even though he doesn't say, put it in clear terms, we are oscillating between the models without any capacity to legitimize what we are doing. What's only left to us to legitimize scientific practice turns out to be, according to Lyotard, in those days, at the end of 1970s, increasing efficiency. Okay. Now, being no longer able to legitimize our practice, the scientific practice, now we demand funds. We legitimize our position in society. We legitimize why the state should invest so much money to these institutions, why they should pay us with salaries, etc. Okay, is that the results of our efforts can contribute to the concern with increasing efficiency. Okay. Now, increasing efficiency, however, has nothing to do with the questions of truth, okay, or questions of justice as well. Increasing efficiency is a response to the demand of the, according to Lyotard again, to the demand of the capitalist market, okay. The market wants to produce more and with increasingly cheaper and cheaper costs. Lower and lower costs. And the question of increasing efficiency comes before us exactly as such a demand turns out to be undeniable. Okay. And increasing efficiency, of course, no longer concerns itself with the questions of science, dealing primarily with knowledge, either for its own sake or the name of truth or the name of justice, whatever, but the questions of technology and techniques. Shall we have a break? Let's do it.